Thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for joining us for this conversation at the beginning of, well, not quite the beginning. It's kind of technically, we're going for opening plenary, but forum's been, we're halfway through. It's been running. All of us have been people, but it's great to have you all here together for this conversation, and I feel honored to be asked to moderate a conversation among some amazing practitioners with whom we'll have a discussion. When we kicked off the conversation, a critical point in my mind was having a discussion about the green transition in this current moment needs to be anchored in the fact that this transition just makes sense. It's difficult, it's challenging, it sometimes requires tough compromises and trade-offs, but it makes sense on many levels. And I think, as you will hear from the amazing leaders here joining me on stage, it's working, it's happening. So without further ado, because you didn't come to just hear from me, we're going to have a conversation. And the goal here is to make it a real conversation. We'll spend a little bit of time having the conversation first over here, but then eventually, and hopefully quite quickly, open it up and invite others into the discussion. Not just to talk about what is or isn't working, but what are the opportunities to do things differently to take advantage of the moment that we're seeing today, which has both its challenges and its opportunities. So with that, I will ask my fantastic panel. I'll call you in the order that you will be seated. So it'll be John, Huda, Ketakandriana, and then Aldo on the far end, please. Let's give them a big hand as they come up. So, we have champions for a different approach to the intersection of people, planet, and prosperity from around the world, working on nature, in agriculture, thinking about energy and technology, thinking about the natural resources that will power the transition and how they are fairly and sustainably accessed. And I think the first question will be one that I will tailor to each of you, but is really around what is working within your work. And so, John, I'll start with you, right? Acre Fund is, a real pillar of the Skoll community, has reached millions of smallholder farmers. People don't typically think of Acre Fund as, say, a climate or an environmental organization, but you have done amazing work in tapping a whole suite of practices and interventions in ways that make sense for the farmer, and you really put the farmer first. Talk a little bit about the work, how it began, this pivot into embracing these techniques and approaches, and what kind of results or traction you're seeing.
Yeah, thanks so much, James. And thanks for having us. Many of the audience might know of Acre Fund because of the Skoll community, but just as a quick reminder for those who might need it, Acre Fund started from fairly humble beginnings, serving 38 farmers in Western Kenya in 2006. This is our 20th anniversary. And we're now serving 5.9 million smallholder farmers in 10 countries in Africa, mostly farmers with less than 1 acre of land, 55% of whom are women. And our goal is still, to this day, to deliver bigger harvests, healthier families, and richer soils. And we do that through a bundled service intervention. We provide finance, inputs close to where farmers live. We help train farmers on how to use those inputs, and we provide access to markets. So that's kind of our core bundle. And as James said, traditionally that wouldn't be seen as a climate intervention. It's certainly building resilience with smallholder farmers. That bundle is insured, so there's a certain amount of climate resilience protection for that finance. But over time, we've realized that we have to do more. About 10 years ago, we started distributing trees. It was a small impact pilot. We were reaching a plateau of impact, so we deliver about 40% income gains per farming household compared to control farmers every year. But we couldn't really go beyond that. And so we started trialing different things that could help boost that at scale and through a low-cost delivery model. And we landed on trees. But I'll be honest, like internally, our teams weren't thrilled. They were like, wait, we're an agricultural organization. We distribute seed and fertilizer and other products. Why trees? They take a long time to yield any benefits. And what we found in our impact surveys was that you could deliver a tree for about 20 cents each, and you'd get about $15 of impact returned over 10 to 15 years. And so what started out as being a few thousand farmers trial, we now distribute 100 million trees a year. We're on track to deliver 1 billion trees by the end of the decade. It's going to be $1 billion of new net assets for those farmers. And that's 40% of all of One Acre Fund's impact. So that's probably our biggest at-scale intervention. When we talk about powering prosperity at scale, I would say that's our number one in the climate space. And just one final thought on why that works so effectively at scale. There's really two main reasons behind that. First, we realized early on that farmer-owned and operated nurseries were far more effective at distributing trees than our centralized nurseries. So it's a bit wonky, but it's pretty obvious. If a tree has to travel 100 kilometers, it's not going to survive as well as a tree that's a mile down the road. But also in terms of providing just and equitable access, you want that tree to be a mile down the road, and you want it to be walking distance for farmers. So decentralization is really the key to our approach at delivering trees at scale, and then really flexible finance, i.e. philanthropy. We can talk about that later.
All right. I'm stuck on the billion trees. And full disclosure, I do have a rooting interest for One Acre Fund, but it watching that journey from we're going to try this out to the billion trees that seemed like an insane objective when we started out, being now technically very much within reach and the infrastructure that comes off that, I think speaks to the momentum that can come from embracing the internal logic of this work. When one thinks of scale, one thinks of a just transition, often from a lack of access to access, and particularly one thinks about energy and renewable energy. It's really impossible to have that conversation without thinking about the work of SELCO, Huda. Over the years, you have become synonymous as an organization with that push to recognize that clean energy, affordable energy, sustainable energy are really the same thing. And then translating that into economic opportunity in various ways. Maybe talk a little bit about where you are in that journey and some of the, both past chapter and where the work takes you today at SELCO Foundation.
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the question. It's great to be here and be part of this gathering. So at SELCO Foundation, we're about 16 years old as an organization. Evolved over the years and evolved because we are based on, the organization is based on action learning and systems thinking, and I think that's just where the path leads you, right? You can't afford to think of things in silos or think of, one aspect at a time when you really need to bring change on the ground. And so we've evolved based on that, understanding of the ground, that partnership that we've created. So at the moment, we primarily work on two verticals. One is livelihoods, of which agri-allied is a huge component of it, and the other is public health. And from a long-term perspective, our vision and goal is to really sort of institutionalize climate-smart solutions. So it could be distributed renewable energy or energy efficiency or green-built environments within these development verticals. Because we truly believe that scale happens when energy is demystified, right? When somebody in the fisheries department is able to, work on it, customize it, make it work, scale it themselves. When somebody in the maternal and childcare department sort of says, this is something that needs to be part of our, expansion and deepening plan and not an afterthought. So the goal is really to build those champions, and we see it scale only when that happens. If you're talking about the nexus of agri-energy, if you have, 100 energy people in the room, you've really failed. But if you have, 100 agri people in the room to be able to understand and talk about energy as a part and parcel of agriculture, not as an afterthought, that really becomes much more powerful from a scale perspective. So just to give you a little bit of an example in terms of how we actually operate and where we are seeing some, needle moving or levers changing. And of course, we've had more failures than successes, so more on that in terms of learnings. But So what we basically do in the livelihood space is we look at the complete value chain, right? So whether it's millets or rice or turmeric or dairy, right? Across the value chain, you have input side, on farm, post harvest, value addition. But the goal is not really to sort of green this value chain. It is to basically see that while greening it, are you really adding value capture to the last mile farmer, to the rural entrepreneur, right? And how do you increase that value capture? And that can only happen if you sort of look at a systems approach, right? Because technology is one aspect, finance, capacity building, markets, government policy, like all of these become enabling conditions for things to happen. So what we essentially do is we use philanthropic capital to understand where these gaps are and to help bridge and catalyze these gaps. So whether it's things like, first loss guarantee funds or high risk R&D resources for local innovators, right? But the goal is really to essentially build enabling conditions at a local level so that people can innovate, people can scale, you have supply chains working at the last mile, right? And similarly, in the healthcare space, it's a space where, whether you talk about maternal and childcare or, NCD or cancer and things like that, energy is really an enabler, it's a catalyst. I think when people say, reliable energy lead to, better number of deliveries, better patient footfall, it's not only energy, it's a combination of things that sort of leads to that, right? And it's a basic human right at this stage, I think, for us to be thinking about, where is the evidence, right? But I think we've come a long way from the healthcare perspective. We, of course, pre-COVID, we were working on it in a very small way where we were building evidence to sort of show that how distributed energy efficiency can be institutionalized in the healthcare space. And I think COVID changed everything because it was exposed the kind of gaps in the healthcare infrastructure, right? Just in terms of equipment, energy, reliability. And we sort of, of course, double down on that, right? So right now, we basically run a program in India and parts of East Africa where we're on track to power about 25,000 health centers, which is close to about 12% of the population in India. And the goal here is really to institutionalize it within the healthcare system, which means health budgets need to be used to procure, install, maintain systems, right? You cannot say, if you go to a health department and they say, no, that's the energy department's problem, don't talk to me about it, that it'll not work there, it'll not sustain there, right? But at the same time, when you're doing the programs, it's very easy to sort of do the CapEx, but maintaining OpEx, institutionalizing, having community ownership, that's where a lot of the learnings sort of lie, right? So that's essentially where we are, primarily doubling down on livelihoods and health. We are, of course, an implementation organization, but systems driven, so we work with a network of partners on the ground to make that happen.
Fantastic. That scale and getting to double-digit share of all the health capacity of a country the scale of India is exciting. And I would imagine that it is an accelerating process, starting from a few and beginning to really bring energy as a core part of the offering. We'll come back to some of the ingredients you need to sweeten or scale the soup a little bit. Kay, in this conversation that we often have about the transition, if you're having a transition conversation in a rich OECD country, it is very much about access to critical minerals and resources to build certain technologies and so on. You're seeing a new wave of engagement in parts of the global south around how do we get your resources out. I mean, you've seen extreme versions of this where countries' health budgets are being held hostage for access to natural resources. And yet, a lot of the people who need to both benefit from, embrace, and add value to these resources are in these parts of the world. And your work is, I think, emblematic of that. Talk a little bit about how you're trying to make sure that this is not a situation where parts of the world contribute the rocks beneath their feet while others get to build and then ultimately use the resulting technologies and benefits.
Thanks, James, and hi, everyone. Let me first speak a little bit about who we are and how we evolved into this current work. So we used to be known as Publish What You Pay. This was a movement, created more than 20 years ago for pushing for disclosure and transparency and accountability in mining, oil and gas revenues. And one of the greatest outcomes of this movement was the creation of the ITI that I think all of us know, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. So that part of the work is not over, but at least, there are strong and tangible milestones that have been put across the years. We are a global movement operating in more than 50 countries across the globe in 5 regions, in LAC, in MENA, in Africa, which is our biggest asset in the movement, but also in Eurasia and Asia Pacific. So that gives you a picture of the globality of our work. I was really impressed when listening to John and Huda, about those billions of trees and all of the concrete infrastructures. We are not making solar panels, but we are policy fixers. We are an organization which ensures that we are creating the policy enabling environment at the global fora, which will foster this energy transition in each and every country where we intervene and globally. So this is something important to seize first, because it's very hard to value that brainy work of policy. Well, it's also linked to our community work, because we have more than 1,000 organization members, community organizers, small farmers, people living on the forefront of this energy transitioning from the darkness for most of people in Africa, as you may know, and elsewhere as well, from darkness to light, from lack of access to clean technology to this access conditioned by openness of policies. So that's a way of transformation in the energy transition, because capital is not sufficient for scaling up the energy transition. We have to break those rules of extractivism, which for long has shaped the world of the energy, how transactions are made, who has access to capital. Let's think of an example of the intellectual property rights, for instance. Now, if you want to really jump into this just energy transition that we are all dreaming of, I'm sure, in this room, it won't happen as long as the global South countries don't have access to those technologies, because we will be doing research and design and development in Africa. If we don't have access to those licenses and permits, then things won't move. So we are here to fix that. And how we are doing this, we are taking local concerns from communities, regional aspirations through the AMV, for instance, the Africa Mining Vision, transforming them into global instruments for transformation. We are targeting the WTO, for instance, the World Trade Organization, saying, hey guys, why don't we change the rules of the game? Let's transform it so that every single country can scale up. So I will give you a single story, maybe 2 stories of success a little bit, how it shaped our work. Has, through Publish What You Pay at the time, released more than $33 billion of assets recovered from mining, and restituted to communities for local transformation. And we have produced also research on changing the economy shape, saying that if in Africa we invested in local value chains, in a single year, that will produce $24 billion of GDP, more GDP, and create 2.3 million jobs. So you see the power of transformation and the power of the communities to reclaim their rights, because that's a justice component in our name, Resource Justice Network. In Balama, in Mozambique, last year, our members managed to recover, reparation for the communities affected by a big mine, exporting graphite, and really helping 500 farming communities to restore their lives and livelihoods. So these are just, small bites, but we are a community of individuals striving for a greener industrialization without this greenwashing that we are seeing here and there.
Something that, and we'll come back to the question of greenwashing, something that really strikes me exactly as you talk about the need for domestic value addition from these resources, and sometimes need to be underlined to people, is, say, for example, that supply chain for panels, right? They're instruments for making renewable energy. Where in the world do they work the best? Where there's plenty of sun, also known as the Global South, also known as the place where the natural resources are coming from. What do you need to convert those natural resources into new panels and new equipment, new batteries? You need energy. And it feels like we have this bizarre process where you take the raw material, take it away from the place it would work best, value add over there, bring a trickle of that energy back to the places where actually for the planet you could get the highest energy yield, which also happens to be the place where you have the labor force looking for dignified work and so on. So there's something broken about the way we are doing things today that if we could get right is actually just better for everyone and for efficiency. And it's to your point, it really sits with policy and enabling structures. Aldo, you are investing in one of the critical lungs of the world and creating value there. And we talk about the green transition from an energy perspective and in terms of agriculture. We also need to make sure that we value the critical role of nature as an asset and that we work in harmony with nature. Talk a little bit about the way that you're investing in the Amazon basin to make sure that communities generate and realize value from being good stewards of our natural bounty.
Thank you, James. I'm really happy to be here. Actually, we started Amazon Impact Ventures in this building after doing a social finance program with my co-founder, Prajani, over there. A few years ago. So,
welcome home.
Yeah, thank you. So, we are, basically based in the UK and Lima in Peru. And we are an impact first investment company. We basically deploy capital to the bioeconomy in the Amazon. That means we work with smallholder farmers, with indigenous communities, we work with small and medium enterprises, but also with ethical buyers, which are also a key part of the value chain. And we work in Peru, in Ecuador, in Colombia, in the Andean Amazon. This year, actually, we started to work also in Brazil. And what we do basically is move that capital to where it's most needed, move it to the bioeconomy. And what is the bioeconomy? So the bioeconomy is, let me put you an example. In Madre de Dios, which is the southeastern part of Peru, a massive region, there is this tree called Bertholletia excelsa, which is the Brazil nut tree. This tree, can live for more than 500 years. It's 50 meters tall, amazing tree. It's the habitat for many species. And this tree produces nuts that, when fallen to the ground in these big pots, like the size of a coconut, they are picked by hand by indigenous families that walk through the forest for many hours to find these nuts, and then they collect them, they aggregate them, they dry them in the sun, and that's their main, basically, livelihood. So the interesting thing is that these Brazil nut trees can only produce in healthy standing forest. So really the business model for that is conservation. There is no tension between profit and between forest protection. So what we do is we provide the working capital to the farmers through their associations to buy the harvest. The associations, they buy the harvest to the farmers at the right time, at a fair price, because if they don't do that, basically illegal miners or illegal loggers, they will do it. And the best way to do it is to work directly with them and provide them also with technical assistance. What we also do is to connect them to ethical buyers, which basically bring those Brazil nuts to the global north, to the markets that can pay more, and they can benefit from that. So we work with companies in France, like Resources Bio, for example. They can sell through a network of organic and fair trade retail stores in France. We work with another company in the US that also they can sell in Whole Foods Market and these kind of stores. So the journey goes from communities on the ground, harvesting those nuts, to the cooperatives that are aggregating, are processing, to ethical buyers that are connecting them to organic markets in Europe or in the US, that to final consumers, which are at the end are eating a superfood, very rich in selenium, rich in healthy fats, and at the end the result is more than 150,000 hectares of forest protected, right? So that value chain for us is how bioeconomy should work, and that's what basically what we are doing. What we see is that, and our approach is to work on the real economy with companies that already exist. We're not investing in startups. We're not investing in projects. Just companies that are already working, that gives alternative incomes for families on the ground, and that they need to grow. They need support. They need technical assistance, but of course they need finance to reach the next level.
So critical to that is this idea that you're moving people away from our current market system looks at a standing indigenous forest and says it's worth the mass of the dead trees within it, right? That's the thing that's worth something, is the timber or the land for farming. In a sense, one question is, are you getting to the point, and I've got two follow-up questions for you. Are you finding that, for example, with the Brazil nut economy, you're able to show that this is worth more than than the alternative of just clear cutting or logging? Or are you finding that you actually need policy, and yes, it's an income, but still people are having to make a choice to defer short-term commercial incentive for the long term? So let's start there. Are you already there? And then I'll ask a follow-up question to that.
No, definitely there is a policy change and improvement, right? Mm-hmm. But certainly what we've seen is there are not many jobs in the Amazon. Yeah. There are not many opportunities. So what we thought is the right thing to do is to invest in those companies that are already giving jobs to communities so they can grow. Mm-hmm. But of course, if you're competing against gold, it's very difficult, right? Illegal gold mining, basically. So it needs to be a policy approach, of course, and as much as investment as possible into the real economy to create other opportunities. Yeah. Brazil nut is one, but there are other products coming from the forest, non-timber forest products, that also can be used. And that can be combined also with cacao, coffee plantations in some areas, in agroforestry systems that can provide also other incomes. In that same region, we're working with other organizations also promoting agroforestry cacao, so they can basically stop the advance of illegal mining. Of course, it's not straightforward and it's very difficult, but I guess that's the challenge, right? Yeah. Try to bring them economic alternatives, and of course provide them also with the technical support to do it. Yeah.
Great. Kay, I'll come to you actually, before we come around, you start to talk about, there's that need for policy. Are there other critical enablers that you're finding you need either more of or that speak to the binding constraints for this work of generating value from the forest?
Yes, definitely there is a lack of finance in general in the Amazonian region. Yeah. Just in Peru, only 3.7% of the national lending reaches the region, and usually for bigger companies. So the missing middle, small, medium enterprises, it's very hard to them to reach local banks, or if they do, interest rates are extremely high. So there is a need of capital, but also, the right type of capital: patient, tolerant, right, flexible, that they can get, and that's what we're trying to do.
So we had talked earlier about the centrality, and Kay, you made a very clear and passionate case for the centrality of policy in enabling better outcomes, and we see it brought to life here in a range of ways. I'm curious because in the policy economy, you're also having to make the case for why take the trade-offs to protect this area or act in the following way. What are you finding is either enabling or inhibiting the success of the kinds of policies that would kind of favor participation in a just and green and global transition?
Yeah. So I think there is a kind of misconception in development finance first, because financiers often, I would say, confuse risk transfer, risk management with actual de-risking. When you are transferring risks, you move risks from an element to another, may it be insurances, tools, stock takes, etc. But the risks don't disappear. What is needed is real de-risking, and what does it mean? That means you treat the root causes of the things that may disrupt the projects. That may be, social dissent, because people have not been consulted. That's the source of the major conflicts we see in the mining area. People have not been consulted nor involved in the design of the project itself. If we could shift that, really change the practices and the policies, that risk would disappear and the project will be sustainable. That's one thing to keep in mind. Political instabilities are another factor of hindrance, for instance. How to solve it? Work on governance, fund more just institutions, more independent oversights of projects at the community level, at the government, building capacities of negotiations within governments as well. So you see, that's the first thing to do in development finance. Another thing to keep in mind, and I'm coming back to your point, extraction, especially in Africa. I come from Madagascar, so that's the place I know best. Only for the moment, only 2% of the resources extracted on the continent are processed internally. The rest is sent outside as raw materials. 57% only are processed in China. I have nothing against China. I have some things against them, but that's not the point here. But as a comparison, in Europe, they process 40% of their local production. And you see the creation of the value, the wealth. So we need to break this imbalance and really allow the countries in the regions being able to build that system. And I think this is where the shift has to happen. That's the barrier, the trade barrier and the finance barrier right now. The development funds that we have are still sustaining this extractive model, not the shift in country and or in region. So that's what we said during the last year in Sevilla. You may remember there was FFT4 for those of you who were involved. We need a new scheme of this development finance. And there is a pact for the future that all of our countries signed, many ceremonies, good speeches, etc., but not followed by action until now, because the funds are not shifting from these models to another. Yeah.
But I want to pick up on that because, yes, we're seeing lots of speeches and handshake. Well, fewer actually now. They're not even bothering to do that right now. And there's something that triggered as you were speaking, which is you talked about the need for far-sighted policy and to engage policymakers to make these decisions and for good governance in general and all the pillars of it. And I'll ask the audience, raise your hand if you're from or live in a country that is not experiencing a good governance recession right now. Right? If you're in a country where good governance is thriving and strengthening at the moment, where democracy is getting stronger, please raise your hand. So that's the world we're all living in.
Yeah.
right? It's the world we're all living in. I think it's something that's all in all our guts. Like we've all done work that's premised on this idea. We will fix the institutions. They will create broad-based prosperity. But we're heading in the other direction. You talked about the WTO and shifting policy there. It's an open question whether the WTO can make a decision right now for reasons that I won't get into because I like having visas.
Me too. Yeah.
But there's that reality. How do you make the case for the kinds of policies that we want to see to people who are not necessarily motivated by some vision of future representative good governance? I'd love to hear just a short reflection on that.
Sure. The most argument who works are always financial. So from people who are investing in those countries, the argument is you will lose your investment if you're not investing in a more sustainable government and governance systems. Anti-corruption has still to sit on the table. It's not a soft safeguard, that's the thing which guarantees that everything works from project design to delivery and implementation and scalability of the projects. And one thing also that I will add is that we need more sanctions. If you want to protect your assets, then allow to stop those sanctions. I get back to the example of Europe. Just imagine that in Africa we are asking ourselves to process 40% of our minerals instead of the 2% right now. It would be seen as a violation of trade policies right now if we did that. And this is what we ask to break. And the WTO challenge is not an impossible one because we are already moving with first mover countries in Africa. South Africa is interested, Senegal, Ghana, we heard positive things from them, Zimbabwe, Mozambique. So that's our role as a community gatherers to make our people convince the government saying, shape and trigger that change at the WTO level so that in 2-3 years maximum, the rules change because we can't afford to wait longer. Development funders will be ruined if we let this system perdure.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Huda, we're in this interesting moment where, for a range of reasons, the adoption curve on distributed renewable energy is going vertical in so many parts of the world. The technologies are getting cheaper, but also the alternatives are becoming harder to access, and it's just logical. What is it that you're at 25,000 health centers and a lot more footprint besides? What is that missing boost to get this to go even faster, or that barrier that you need to get over in some way?
Yeah. So the thing with the energy access sector very often, or the renewable energy sector very often, is they look at the problem from a supply perspective. So it's all about, okay, how many more megawatts, how many more systems, how many more units. And I think that very often ends up creating more problems than solutions. I mean, just to give you a couple of examples, if you're scaling water pumps, right, and this is touted as a very big success, which it's not, right, because very often when you're scaling water pumps, solar water pumps, right, you're not actually looking at the problem statement, which is reliable water, right? So which means the program has to be designed in a manner which combines protective irrigation, crop typology, things like, drip irrigation, foggers. It has to sprinklers. It has to combine all of those with your solar water pump. But in most places where solar water pumps have scaled, you actually have people who've migrated and they've left the farms because you've now removed water for free, unlimited over time, right? So very often, and this example, you can use examples of this across the board, right? Like maternal and childcare also. It's not about, providing solar. It's about that experience of the mother, right? Which will include aspects of passive building design, cooling technologies. It will include community-driven sort of, ownership on this. So I think somewhere when we, as an energy sector, if we really focus on the problem statement, the potential to design the program in a manner which actually solves that problem is immense, right? And so I think coming to the gap, right, it is a systems challenge, It's not about electric vehicles and so that it's about transportation. And I think the moment we misunderstand that, the danger is just too vast and we miss that opportunity to actually create lasting change. But here the biggest gap for us has been, where are the systems thinkers and systems practitioners, right? Because I think even in government very often you actually have like departments which are called line departments. They're called line departments for a reason, right? They function that way, right? You don't have like, you actually have a policy which is climate policy, heat stress and agriculture, which are 3 different policies. Like that doesn't make sense, right? So I think for us the biggest gap has been, where do you actually have that crop of systems thinkers and more so systems practitioners which are going to drive for systemic long-term change, which is more sort of, how do you embed things, right? But for that, I think you have a lot of people that are getting trained as project task management. You have people that are getting trained as program designers. But I think we really see a gap in where is that crop of people going to come from that are going to actually push for systems-based practice in the long term. Because all of these problems are pretty wicked one way or the other. So.
We are in a stage of the cycle, or of a cycle, a mimetic cycle, just in terms of what people are talking about. I remember coming to Skoll a few years ago and, hearing among all the social entrepreneurs and the funders, hey, systems change. And it's become kind of the term du jour. And if, I'd think that we'd be pointing to all these systems that are changing. Yeah. But we're all talking about it, and now people come back and say, well, folks aren't willing to really back systems change. It's hard to do. People are calling things system change that aren't really that. You've centered the idea of systems change. What is a hidden lever within that's bringing it to life in your work?
Yeah. So there are a few things, right? One is definitely having resources which allow you to learn, which allow you to fail, which allow you to do things in a manner which is more long term, right? So I think for us, we are able to practice systems and be on that journey only because we have funding partners like that. And I'm using the word partners for a reason, right? Because they are sort of saying, let's learn together, let's get on this journey together in terms of how do you navigate, right? And when it comes to systems, there are 2 types of practices, right? There's systems emergence and systems dynamics. So with systems dynamics means you are mapping out the system, you're understanding the root cause, and you're really working on those gaps. But systems emergence is something that you need to learn as you go, right? And I think we end up doing a combination of the 2, and for a reason, right? Because I think when it comes to moving the needle, it is a lot about people and not so much about processes and other things, because at the end of it, if we don't identify and invest in champions at multiple levels, you're not going to have that needle moving, right? So for us, it's about identifying those individual champions that actually have the capacity to shift mental models. And a lot of this is mental models, the supply side problem, right? Like even when we started the health program, for a long time there was no movement because you actually had people thinking this is not a health problem, right? But you needed that champion who kind of has that this has to be owned by health, and then really invest and follow that champion around wherever they move so that we can actually change things, institutionalize things. So for us, the success is not the 25,000. The success is the fact that when an emergency helpline is called for women or emergencies or whatever, it's like dial 4 for solar related issues. Like that is the level of institutionalization. The fact that the next time someone wants to raise resources to power a health center, they don't actually have to look outside the system, right? You have this as part of the policy. So I think for us, those things are really kind of, things which that, okay, now it's part of a parliament agenda, no one can remove that. Yeah. But again, you never know, right? The next person who comes, they can remove it. But I think having a good crop of systems practitioners, and not only systems practitioners, but people who can basically get things moving on the ground from an outcome perspective. Otherwise, you end up having a lot of checklists and a lot of, celebration of that.
So I'll editorialize a little bit there. One of the things that I take away from that is, other than champion stalking, find the champion, go with them and work with them, is you're often making connections across. And you talked about line ministries, but we have a lot of line organizations that have raised a lot of money that we do this and not that. And you look around and you realize that unless you're really cutting across so that the energy organization, the agricultural organization, the health organization are thinking of themselves as being part of an integrated system in a way, you're going to struggle to get places. Now, John, you are in a big entity, at least as far as the agricultural systems of the countries you're in are concerned. And it seems you've unlocked this engine of value. But I'm assuming it's not all smooth sailing. We're sorted. We're going to have lots of rich smallholder farmers coming as a result of this. What's is there a rate limiting kind of aspect of the work that you've been trying to do around green transition and helping farmers think about new practices or new products?
Sure. How long have you got?
We can all see the clock.
43.35 minutes.
Yeah.
I would like to get to questions, so I'll
Yes.
try to be short. Look, I think there are a couple of things holding us back. And actually, it's important to think about this from the smallholder balance sheet, not the One Acre Fund balance sheet. James asked me not to say that we need more money. So I'm going to get that out at the beginning rather than the end and just say, only 0.3% of climate finance is going to smallholder farmers. So if we look at a just green transition, it is simply not possible at that margin. Only 10% of finance is going to adaptation, right? 90% to mitigation, and smallholders are on the front line of climate change. So that's out of the way, James, and I won't say that again, I promise. But there are two things that are happening, right? We every year in one of our markets, or maybe three, we have an extreme weather event. And then now, with increasing frequency, we're having an extreme financial event. And, the 1,000-pound elephant with a shade of orange in the room is someone has decided to upend the fertilizer markets and increase fertilizer prices by 50% today. If it carries on getting worse, that's going to get up to 100% pretty quickly. And a lot of farmers don't have access to fertilizer anyway. And a lot of our operations will have fuel shortages within the next 3 months. So a lot of folks look at One Acre Fund and they say, when are you going to become commercially viable? When is your balance sheet going to be break even? And arguably, when are One Acre Fund clients going to be break even? And in that context of extreme weather events and financial shocks, I personally believe that's impossible. There are a couple of things we can do about that, not to be all doom and gloom. Firstly, I think we saw in Zambia when a couple of seasons ago they had a 1 in 100 year drought. On average, Zambian farmers lost about 50% of all their harvests. We were able to reduce that by 50%. So we still had some losses in our operations, but a few things we did. One, we were able to increase insurance coverage. Super important. Insurance can be boring, so I won't go into detail, but happy to if anyone has any questions about it. Secondly, we increased the amount of agroforestry species on farm long term that can support soil moisture retention in drought years. Thirdly, we were able to switch to an early maturation seed that we could deploy very quickly. So farmers were actually able to grow in a much shorter growing season because we knew the rains were not going to be great that year. And that meant we suffered a lot fewer losses. So for extreme weather, we know more or less what the toolkit is financially and in terms of our operations. A lot of it rests on agility. With financial risk, it's actually much harder because you're dealing with a financial shock in real time that you didn't plan for necessarily. And organizations like One Acre Fund or smallholder farmers don't have financial mechanisms that are fit for purpose. You don't have guarantee funds that work for you or your farmer clients. Your working capital is tied to various assumptions, etc. There's a couple things that I think we can do there. Firstly, I think there's a whole suite of financial mechanisms that haven't even been invented yet. There's a guarantee facility that we don't have for the smallholder sector. There are outcomes bonds that don't exist for smallholder farmers yet. There's carbon finance that isn't designed for smallholder farmers, but we have some ideas on how to design it for them. The other thing that I think is going to happen, and Churchill said, purportedly never let a good crisis go to waste, and he actually said that because at the founding of the United Nations, which is a bit ironic in our multilateral situation right now. But I think the alternative fertilizer industry could be catalyzed by the current emergency. And just to close that thought, I think the way that that's going to take off is firstly with a lot of flexible finance. But secondly, through decentralization, just like our tree program through decentralized tree nurseries. If you can bring that close to the farmer, if you can bring those new technologies, a cornucopia of new things like biochar, green ammonia, and decentralize it across the African continent, we'll quickly see a decoupling of some of those policy and financial constraints.
Great. I had two reflections on that, John. The first one is, there's that story that if you added up all of the fragments of the 1-2 cross that were being sold as religious relics, you'd have a fleet of ships. I wonder if you added up all of the quotes attributed to Winston Churchill, you'd have more words than any one human being could have ever said in his in his life. But it is true, never let a good crisis go to waste. So taking that to heart, but you brought us to the current moment of extreme geopolitical uncertainty. We have an El Nino brewing in the background. I did want to, as I pivot to inviting the other members of this conversation into the discussion, to just as a last invitation, ask, are there any particular ways that this moment, whether it's the situation in the Gulf or some of the geopolitical dynamics of the moment, we've seen what's happened in places like Venezuela and elsewhere, are there ways in which that is specifically affecting the way that you're thinking about the moment of either opportunity or challenge ahead? And I'll just open it up in case there are things that are specific about this moment for any of your organizations. Please.
I was a few weeks ago in this region in Madre de Dios, and I could see long queues of people just trying to buy fuel. Mm-hmm. I mean, so simple as that. But I think that's affecting the gold miners, because now it's more difficult to do it. Mm-hmm. But of course, it's affecting everyone, right? Mm-hmm. And as John was saying also, I mean, the margins are not high in these kind of businesses. Yeah. So if you're increasing fuel prices, that affects transport that you need to bring by boat, Brazil nuts from one community to the city, is really massive. Yeah. That impact. So yeah. In terms of policy. Also, what we've seen also in Peru is that, of course, there is a lack of general support, bilateral support, mm-hmm. right? Has reduced, and some of these organizations and programs, even governmental programs supporting agriculture, supporting non-timber forest products, also are struggling to continue. So definitely that's another. Yeah. Another aspect.
Okay, Huda, any other impacts?
Yeah. Definitely. The first impact is, of course, on people and defenders, mm-hmm. and in that region, because the civic space which was already shrinking, is more and more scarce. So that's one thing that we need to keep an eye on. Definitely the human factor, and then. It's a bit ironic, because when this war started, then I immediately thought, if only people were listening to everything that we as civil society and change makers, were saying for the last 20, 30 years, we would have invested earlier in renewable energies, then there won't be this fossil fuel crisis. Mm-hmm. That was just a thing. It's ironic, but it's not impossible, nonetheless, to solve this dilemma. It's not too late yet if we take the right decisions, to jump into this real energy transition. And development finance have a role to play in it. If you were to leave this panel today with one thing, for me, it would be we need finance that covers the full chain, the value chain, not just, the capex. Think of the people. We need the rights centers, people-centered business model for making the energy transition work, and that's really important for scalability. Yeah. Combining two things. One strength is local energy access and rights-based lane. Mm-hmm. It won't work alone if we keep that only. Then you have to use also national sovereignty. That's what we spoke with resource-rich countries, and plugged also into industrial policy lane. If you do that together, then we have this successful energy transition that will help solving the current crisis.
Fantastic. Huda?
Yeah, the biggest shortage that has happened in India is the LPG gas, and it so turns out that a lot of the industry and the restaurants and the upper levels are not as affected because they do have the capital to invest in increased, costs of LPG cylinders. But the ones that are really completely shutting down is your small bakeries, your eateries, your small restaurants, your street vendors. Like those are the ones that are completely shutting down one way or the other. And you have solutions that are working like in niche, like little bit small numbers, like people are trying to do alternative gases, they're trying to do biogas, they're trying to do biochar, they're trying to do induction stoves, etc. But I do have to point out that somewhere the R&D space on cooking, like need-based cooking and the options, and I think this is another area that we get into looking at a lot of the supply side thinking on why clean cooking has failed in many ways to really address the challenge at scale. We do need a lot more good flexible R&D grants for local innovations on alternatives to LPG for sure, because it's a very, we moved from biomass to LPG, and then what next? There's a big gap on the technology side itself.
As a deeply scarred but still committed clean cooking investor, I'm nodding along. And we're in an interesting moment right now. Let me invite questions from, you're not an audience, you're part of the discussion. So let's get you in here. We'll start with the lady at the front here.
Hi, thank you so much. Hopefully this is I'm an energy system researcher here at Oxford, so this panel is just, music to my ears. And I have a couple of questions, mostly, I think, probably relevant to all of you, but Huda, a couple of things you said really brought some questions to mind. On the kind of rights-based framework, which Kay also brought up, I always struggle with this. I also am always thinking, right, this is a human right, energy is a human right. Why can't we all just agree on this? But there's so much kind of market-driven thinking around energy that doesn't account for it as a human right. So I was wondering if you could maybe reflect on that a little bit further and how you operate within such a market structure while still having this rights-based approach. And then also, on the kind of what you were getting at around needing these kind of local demand side, kind of demand-informed solutions where you're looking at what local people actually need and forming the transition based on that. Totally agreed. That's exactly what I'm trying to do research on. And what I've keep running into is the fact that that's absolutely wonderful, and I want to do it at scale, and no one wants to fund it at scale. People don't want to do the kind of deep qualitative engagement that's needed to kind of target those really, community-oriented clean energy solutions. And so how do you envision the kind of specificity and scale marriage in these energy solutions longer term?
Very easy questions. While you're noodling over those, we'll take one more. Let's take those two gentlemen. Let's take those two, and we'll come to you in the next loop. The two ladies here will come to you in the next loop. So the two of you.
Thank you. A very wonderful conversation. My name is Johannes, founder of Huda Solar. I work in solar energy in Africa. My question is, when we think of Africa, it's the population 600 million, 700 million people who don't have access to electricity. To give a context, the amount of people, I lived in Latin America for 4 years. There is a population of 750 around that million people, including Caribbean. That means the population of the people who don't have access to sustainable energy in Africa is approximately similar with the continent that has more than 98% access to energy. So if you see Latin America, there may not be equality, but there is accessibility. So you mentioned only 2% of natural resources are processed in Africa. So how we can make sure to power prosperity in Africa when we think of only 2% of natural resources processed, at the same time having 600 million, even more than that, not having access to sustainable energy. Thank you.
Hello, Felipe from Colombia with Fair Trade Certified. Thank you so much for the work that you do, and thank you for the conversation. I heard some really interesting and exciting concepts around distributive solutions, around communities doing their needs assessments, around systemic transformation. In the fair trade movement for the last 30 years, we've really tried to focus on the small-scale system in terms of communities having participation, transparency, democracy, and the capability to drive collective action and identify community-driven solutions. I would love to get your perspective as to, in your work, how relevant is it still to build that social fabric and to recognize where that social fabric exists to bring your solutions on top of it?
Great. All right, let's pause there. We will take the next batch. We'll start, Huda, with you, and then I'll invite all the panelists to dive into whichever parts of the questions that they want to reflect on.
Yeah, no, happy to dive into both the questions. So a lot of times I think even when I started, I was talking about how you need to sort of stop talking about energy or clean energy or climate as an afterthought. Like really what doesn't work is when we introduce like climate funds or energy funds or mini grid programs, they really don't end up sticking. But I think the moment you end up integrating it as part of a health program rollout, an agri program rollout, it almost, I feel like we are at a time and age where we don't need to be defensive about like this is better than that. And like you said, it is the only option in most situations, and it is the best, and it turns out to be the most viable option. So I think we've also moved from being more defensive to a lot more offensive, saying, show us a better option, right? I mean, just to give you an example, right? A local woman entrepreneur who's making rotis or bread making machine, right? Like for her, it doesn't matter if it's solar powered or not. What matters for her is that I'm going to get a good 3-year finance and good reliable servicing, and I'm going to be able to grow my business with this combination, which just so happens to be, by the way, solar powered, right? And I think a lot of what we end up doing is that, like, because the largest Powering Health program, it's actually a health program, but the money is coming from carbon emissions and carbon resources, but no one on the ground cares about carbon neither. But it's about slicing and dicing that narrative, right? What's important to the health department is your footfall, your patient waiting time, your staff feeling more confident. Great. So that's what you kind of promote. And what's important to the, gap funders or, other funders that are coming in is how much are my carbon emissions? And it just so also, and what ends up happening is when you are trying to push both, there's also a connection, a very deep connection between adaptation and mitigation. There's no separating the two, because a lot of times when you're taking people on a clean energy and a low carbon journey, they tend to stay on that ladder, right? So it's a lot of future emissions that we are talking about when you're talking about leave no one behind, right? Otherwise, I think it's we've been asked questions like, okay, but by improving this person's income, you're actually adding to the carbon. So it's a bit like, what fund is this?
Stay poor for the planet.
So I think, so I mean, that's one thing. And the social fabric piece that you brought up, I think it's without considering community and social fabric, nothing ends up actually being adopted or scaled. So I think like this is something which we end up baking in, because as you rightly said, not many people have the appetite to even understand the diversity that certain places have, right? So I think like the behavioral aspect of it, the perception aspect of it is extremely critical, and a lot of that is about narrative building and building very local end user champions that end up having a ripple effect then. It's
fantastic.
Yeah, I wanted to maybe build on that and to answer your question, but also yours on social capability and then how to power up Africa. First thing, every time that an investor or a funder wants to build a project somewhere, in my sense, they have to think and to assess the sustainability and the humanity of that project through a few questions. Will it build local capability or just generate asset broadly, and export those assets once again? Will it benefit the local population? How to create that ownership, this sense of it belongs to us, we help building it, and we will be benefiting for it. Because otherwise, if the answer is no, then it's not sustainable. Forget about it. Another question we have to keep in mind also is that with this project, help the country sustain also its own governance, its own trajectory of development, or will it benefit other regions or other countries? That's another lens, to look at it. But I mean, the social fabric, and it's embedded and linked to your question, is more than ever needed, because people, we are all striving for and starving for a form of development. This development is not the same depending on the context, For us in Madagascar, for instance, development today, if you speak of energy transition, would just be access to electricity. That would be fantastic, because for now only 25% of us have access. So if tomorrow, if we happen to 50% of us have it, that's already development. But beyond that, the way that energy transition projects are structured today are just between corporates, governments, and funders, development finance, those who have the money. We often forget about the people, or we go consult them once a project is messed up, to not use another word, and then we got the community saying, hey, we're gonna pay you this compensation so that you shut up and then just don't disrupt the rest of the projects. That's how things are made up today. If we added the social fabric component in it, involving communities since the very beginning of the thoughts, we would avoid all of this mess. And I think we will be transforming it into an inclusive development strategy instead of a narrow decarbonization corridor that we have right now. And finally, to answer a question on why Africa is still left behind, we have all of the resources, but I think one of the things which impedes us to get there, despite the excellent initiatives, from the World Bank, Mission 300, etc., that's a governance lens that we often forget about, because the assets are captured. Sorry to get back to Madagascar again. We have everything you want in terms of biomass or renewable sources of energy, but yet 65% of our electricity production relies on fossil fuel. Why? Because these fossil fuel guys are the ones giving money to the president during the elections, and they are, making deals saying, keep the market for us, don't open up for renewables so that we can finance you. So it's those revolving doors that we need to shut down and cut out in Africa. That's just my personal opinion from a lived experience. But
Aldo, then John.
Yes.
Anyway.
Like to address now Felipe comment, what the fair trade movement has done, I think, is incredible. Yeah. We go to the ground, we see the cooperatives, we assess them directly, we talk with the farmers when we have to do an investment, and we see the difference between a cooperative with good governance, with really strong, and others. What we've seen now is that, the new cooperatives that have been created by the sons or the daughters of the older farmers are better managed in terms of, professionally better managed, but they are lacking that social cohesion. They are lacking that governance. And that's something that worries us, of course, and something I think also that needs to be addressed. But certainly, we see the difference. When there is good governance, really cooperatives run much better.
As we come to these questions, I did want to offer an observation on the energy question and the energy access question as well, just from a slightly different perspective. I actually think that we have fallen into a false choice frame that says, well, there's energy for industry and then there's an energy access problem. And we inevitably talk in Africa in particular about the people without energy. What we don't do is talk about the business case for investing in energy. And business cases for investing in energy sit on showing a productive use that will generate returns. And to me, the case for going after increasing from 2% to 40% is exactly that it is the only way you can deliver affordable energy for all, is to say we are building an industrial energy system that as a byproduct, as it has everywhere else in the world, will then serve the consumer. Oh, and by the way, as another byproduct, that richer, more advanced economy will have consumers who can afford to pay for power. I think we've ended up in Africa, and actually it's very almost exclusively in Africa, thinking about, can we make the solution cheap enough, simple enough, marginal enough that a poor person can maybe have a little bit of access, instead of saying, can we stop this person being poor? and also build an energy system that allows them to be productive participants in the economy. So that's just a personal view, just stepping out of moderator and providing a little bit of a provocation. I don't think Africa has an energy supply problem. It has a bankable energy demand problem. And if we solve that, the rest will follow. But coming to the next wave of questions.
Hello. I'm Mayfreen. I'm from India. A very straightforward question. Because I'm looking at it from a point of view where we co-create change. But then from the conversation that I've listened just now, is also looking at how accountable are we if such of these initiatives that we think we invested on people or with people, when these solutions actually fail. What kind of accountability do, for example, 1 Acre Land or SELCO Foundation, etc., what kind of accountability do you take? That's one question. And the second question is, if I look at it from a co-creating point of view, is there a co-creating system where these companies that you work in, come forth with the communities that you say you serve, and also looking at that co-creating concept of, if at all we are co-creating, then where is the equitable share of profit in the investment that you say you're making?
Hi, I'm loving this discussion. My name's Ntabi Mosia. For the last decade, I've been running a solar company in West Africa focused on energy access, and have recently pivoted exactly to the point that you've raised, thinking more at a systems level, how do we build utility scale systems to power industry? So I'm kind of at this nexus. But before you had raised that point, I actually wanted to point the question to Huda. I think in the energy access world, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, the off-grid and mini-grid sector, a lot of what you said about kind of focusing on megawatts and kind of just scale in terms of numbers of electrons versus a systems approach, it's quite obvious that it's not working. So if you look at the state of like disrepair in the off-grid sector, many of these systems are deployed and then not used or irreparable. On the mini-grid side, we're seeing a lot of these either being abandoned or having structural issues, and yet we just see more programs, whether it's M300 or once again focusing on the exact same metrics, thinking, okay, we just need to put more money behind this under a different name, and it's going to solve the problem. So how do we break this madness? I think this is my question. Because I think, and small story, sorry. I started my company when we were in grad school, actually, and we studied the SELCO Foundation in a class. And we loved your systems approach, but when we went out into the market and we were trying to raise funds, it's very hard to get that patient, long-term thinking. So I just wanted to think about how do you export those learnings in a context like Africa where the need is so great and we're just repeating the same madness. Yeah.
Okay. Avoiding the repetition of madness. That is a good idea. I will take one more so that we have a triad again, and we'll go in the middle. I haven't seen any questions from this side, so I'm assuming we're very satisfied. All right, we'll do them all as a batch. So the lady at the back and the lady at the front, and then we'll do a last. Whew. All right, why don't we do this? We'll take that one, and then we'll take these two in a separate set. Please.
I'll promise to be short. Hello, my name is Sunita Kaimal. I'm with the Natural Resource Governance Institute, and we work with low and middle income countries to help them advance sustainable development and just energy transitions. I have a comment and a question. James, thanks so much for your question to the audience about whether good governance is actually thriving in any locations. And I think that we are seeing this trend that good governance is on the decline. We're also hearing from this conversation that there is a need to focus on critical minerals and the increasing demand for critical minerals. And yet there was a funding scan that was just produced by the Trust and Accountability Initiative that showed actually investment in mineral governance is declining. So I think if we're going to power prosperity, we need to address that paradox. I have a specific question for Kay. You spoke about the importance of policy and the enabling framework for powering prosperity. And I'm curious, given what's happening in the multilateral space and the international policy space, where are you seeing opportunities to advance policy? And if you could share with us what might give us some possibilities for solutions or hope in that policy space. Thank you.
Great. 3 very easy questions. Kay, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sunita, for the question, and that's really relevant and critical, if I may say, because there are some things that we need to build. I think most of us are familiar with the UNFCCC processes, the COPs. Last year, it was the first time that the transition minerals were brought really on the table and recognized from the outcomes of COP30 in Belém in Brazil, with the creation of the just transition minerals mechanisms, really just transition mechanisms, sorry. So on paper, it looks great, but now we want to translate this into something concrete. And COP31 is therefore key for building on that first need on the policy level. And let's not forget, especially for us from Africa, that next year, COP32 will be in Addis Ababa. That will be a key point on the policy side for really showcasing our needs as a continent, and also this transformative pathway that we need to, tell the world, let's engage into this greater thing, this building prosperity together. So that's part of the policy processes that are currently underway. Then the G7 has also disclosed their green minerals roadmap or policy. I can't remember. We are currently analyzing it at Resource Justice Network, and we will be publishing the results. But one of the feelings that we have is that it is still missing this people-centered lens, that I've tried to explain to you today, just driving by supply chains, etc. So these are some of the things that we need to consider: OECD, G7, G20,
Trying to get the other 2 questions in. So lots of institutional frameworks to get into.
Yeah.
John, there was a question around accountability in particular that I want to be sure you speak to as well.
I'm scared to answer that one and be held to accountable, but I'm learning a lot about the energy transition in this session. The ag food systems community, we always look at the energy guys and we're like, wow, they get all the money and everything's fine, and solar panels are cheap and whatever, so this is good therapy for me. But I think that you raised a really important question. I've never actually heard anyone ask this question publicly in an event before, of like, what happens when something fails? Who's accountable for that? And in ag, that's specific to a lot of the technologies or systems or financial products that we roll out, right? And it's extraordinary to me how often this goes wrong in the field. So just to give you a small example, we're trialing a virtual agronomy tool with CGIAR in Rwanda. Obviously the AI revolution is coming, but from year 1, it looks like it's going to take a while. And the reason being is that it really, the agronomy tool was not designed with farmers in mind, not smallholder farmers in Rwanda specifically. And it's coming up with all kinds of recommendations that to a scientist at CGIAR sound great, right? But firstly, they're not really understood in Kenya or Rwanda. Secondly, they're not actually accurate to what that soil type needs. And so you have to be able to design with farmers in the field and leaders in their community and field staff that you work with together for many seasons before you can roll technology out. And you often find that does not happen in the laboratory. And I promised I wouldn't say we need money, but sorry. R&D is severely under-resourced, specifically for community co-development and human-centered design of new moonshot solutions in the energy transition.
I'll pick up on that for 1 second. We talk a lot about empowering communities and societies. One of the things that we can do is empower indigenous scientists and researchers with lab capacity and other things. Like, part of the reason why things end up being so distant is we're not backing that deep pool of stranded human potential to actually do localized science and research and development. And that's sometimes lost because that young person with an advanced degree is not a particularly charismatic beneficiary in some ways. They don't look like they're struggling to survive, but they're the key to unlocking a whole bunch of opportunity elsewhere. So You are not allowed to ask for money. I'm allowed to say, anyone who's thinking of deploying resources, unlocking this question of building that deep scientific and technical capability is one of the most leveraged things you can do in terms of really localizing innovation. But Aldo?
Maybe just to mention that what also we see in the forest is that lack of connectivity with the main line, with the power lines. And there are many value chains that depends on that capacity to really, use equipment and freeze, palm pulps that needs to be sold, in the cities. And without that infrastructure, it's very difficult that these SMEs really progress. Mainly in the indigenous communities, I would say more than 50% they don't have access to energy. So what you were saying about Latin America is, I think, is completely true. I mean, we think that it's very well connected, but that's mainly around the big cities, and perhaps in the case, for example, Peru, Ecuador, in the coast and the Andes, but in the Amazon, it's a completely different landscape. That lack of connectivity affects the growth of the companies, their revenues, their margins, and of course the livelihoods of indigenous communities. Right?
Huda, do you want to add anything?
Yes.
Please.
I just want to come in to stop the madness question because it kind of took me also into a good thinking spiral. I think that the one thing, and I think there was also something about accountability and profit sharing. The one thing that we try to do is within these programs bake in as much equity and inclusion as possible, right? So the health program, for example, we had baked in social procurement as a mandate. So while it's a scale program, and you can imagine because it's scale, you get, procurement benefits in that, right, where the costs go lower, but we sort of made sure that governments and entities were procuring from people that were able to set up branches, local entrepreneurs, local language speaking entrepreneurs, and that had a fair bit of a spillover effect because while they are setting up their branches and servicing for the health centers, they could actually now justify the transaction cost for doing many other things within the community, right? Just coming on failures, I think there have been so many failures, and we host something called impactfailure.org. We've done it 3 years in a row. It hasn't been easy. When we started to get people to talk about their failures, there were a lot of learnings there. I think we're very quick to saying, this failed because that's a problem, this is a problem. I think we just kept two simple rules. One is, can we be more self-reflective and talk about our own failures, because otherwise it becomes very operational and difficult to kind of, solve. But over the years, and I think the failure conclave that we've hosted has gotten quite a bit of traction from people not willing to speak to people wanting a spot. But that still remains a huge challenge, I think, just being able to talk and transparently document and failures, because I think the cost of failures is not as high as the cost of inaction or not being transparent, So I think it's good and okay to fail as long as you are documenting, talking about it so that things don't, end up being. And the fact that you said that, because I remember the first paper that I wrote on failure of mini grids was 2015, but you're right, nothing has changed, and it just gave me such a bit of a fright, because literally when we talk about so many things today, like finance and pumps and things like that, Harish will pick up a document from 1984 saying, just read this, you find no difference, and it's so scary. But I think the goal is to really keep chipping away and hope that, a big chunk somewhere breaks off. But it really kind of, I think unless we are not, if we just get behind it as a sector, I think there's a lot more possible and so much potential to do that, right?
Last two questions.
Thank you very much. This is on. But my name is Natalie Montesino. I'm with a group called the Climate Democracy Initiative. And really our theory here is much in line with what we've been discussing today, that fair, transparent, democratic processes lead to de-risking development and moving a community from being the victim of extraction to actively inviting in the type of development that they want to see on their terms. And I don't think we need to belabor the point that good governance is the right thing to do and that it's actually good for business as well. I think we're all on the same page about that. But what we're seeing, particularly in the US context right now, is that good governance is, it's not matching with the policies that are being deployed or removed. And so how can we best communicate to developers, to philanthropy, that actually investing in good governance as a precursor to policy is part of this entire chain? What works in practice?
Next one. It was right here, the last question.
Thanks very much. Great panel, by the way, and it's been very inspiring to hear from all five of you. I run a climate tech venture build business and focus on emerging markets in Asia. And so, not surprisingly, the business that we've built are very similar to some of the business that you're talking about, which is around decentralized solar, it's around agri-food businesses, solar irrigation, decarbonizing rice, etc. And so we built 24 of these companies, and they're broadly in those two areas. I would love to hear stories about how you've managed to scale, because obviously they're highly, highly fragmented. Doing it in a small area, with a small community or a small region is one thing. Doing it across multiple geographies or multiple countries is just challenging, obviously. So I'd love to hear stories about how all of you have managed to scale the impact of what you're doing. Okay. If we have time.
Oof, all right. We will take responses to the questions and closing remarks in order, and maybe we'll start Aldo on that end and come this way.
Well, yeah, I mean, what we see is that definitely there are some companies that are going to remain small and will serve some populations, some communities. I would say most of the ones we work in isolated areas will stay kind of the same size. They will grow a little bit, but the scale is really not one of the main things we are preoccupied in that sense. What we think is that what we need to do is to actually deploy more capital to different small companies so they can create and improve their local economies. You know? And what I know that you want John not to talk about raising capital, but I can. No. So no, what we see is that really investors, they want to invest in the Amazon, of course, it's very appealing, larger tickets, right? 5, 10 millions or more. But what we see is that the reality on the ground is completely different. You know, these small companies, they need 100,000, 200, 500, right? A bit more, less than 1 million. So how there's a mismatch basically between what investors need and what the companies need on the ground. So we think that there is a need of specialized vehicles to conduct that capital, conduct it to the right places. And in that sense, the idea is to deploy it and support the ecosystem. It's not just the companies that they need to grow, and in order to scale it, it's not just the companies that need investment, it's the whole ecosystem, right? Service providers, you need incubators, accelerators, of course, and you need technical assistance that is very much needed in order to do it. Yeah,
great, thank you. Okay, very briefly.
Very briefly, how to communicate with governments and investors. I mean, it's really documenting the costs of not investing in governance. And recently, as you may have seen, there were all of these chains of Gen Z revolutions across the globe. And they were linked, partly, if you analyze them, to the energy transition. Lack of access to basic services such as electricity, prompted also by corruption, led to those uprisings. And then it leads to social and political instability in a chaos mode. So that's a way of communicating it. And one of the things to conclude with for me is a call for us to help on this big Breaking the Barriers campaign that we have engaged, targeting the WTO, as I said. There are many country members out there. We are just starting with a few ones, targeting this 2028 ministerial meeting. We need your help for doing that. If you know governments who are keen, if your own governments would be keen, to help step up and break those trade and finance barriers to the energy transition, to contact us, because we would love to synergize the effort. We are not pretending that we can do it alone. Thank you.
It is definitely a combination of, public, private, and civil society that is needed to bring any change. And we do feel and we see that, whatever type of entity, there are different drivers, right? Like compliance drivers. And you find very often that a program is so heavy on compliance that it misses the point of it. Or, you have M&E teams driving programs, or you have procurement teams driving programs. And I think that's really where the pull and push should be healthy, where it's always about the end user centricity and the sort of program design, which should matter more than what these tensions are on compliance and M&E and other aspects. I think from a closing perspective, there are three things that we are sort of looking at moving forward. Like one is, I think it's time that we really look at building more futuristic models that are actually built on the strength and agency of people rather than the need and bridging gaps essentially. But how do you really build safety nets, right? What is that escape velocity which actually prevents a family from going back into poverty or abject poverty? I think that's something that really needs convergence and program design thinking on the ground. The second thing is really building customized journeys for people, because at the end of it, we are talking about people. Like there is no, a million farmers need a million solutions. There's no way that, you can say, one would work for everything, because at the end of it, if you're not building agency of people, right, end users that can become, owners, decision makers, leaders, trainers, end users can't just stay end users, right? So flipping that piece is kind of very critical. And I think at the end of it, one of the last thing that I want to say is that we've been, for the last 3 or 4 years, we've been on a journey trying to influence digital platforms and digital public goods thinking into energy systems programming. And that's been a very steep learning curve, just in terms of the potential that it has to transform the way in which we are designing programs, both on the supply and demand side. So whether it's AI or it's digit or it's maintenance and servicing, or it's actually listening to voices on the ground, like why can't we actually hear from members of a cooperative if something is working directly, right, in multiple languages? And I think that's really has been a powerful change for us to really reimagine the way in which we are designing and rolling programs out.
I want to hear your closing remarks. I'll say 2 words.
Please.
Farmers first. That's our motto at One Acre Fund.
All right. Fantastic. I will say more than 2 words, but the brevity of that was powerful. I think on the question of scale, I did want to make one reflection. I think, yes, you've got fragmented jurisdictions, but you actually have geographies with common needs. And sometimes people say, well, Africa is all these different markets. They're different in some ways, they're similar in others. And I think developing countries have that. And there is a precedent for creating massive returns at scale and massive transformations at scale when you have a big technological transformation. The mobile revolution swept across the developing world, whatever term you want to use today, very rapidly. Multiple different companies in multiple different places, because suddenly there was a solution that spoke to a need people had always had and that was not being met well. I would argue that in some of what you're hearing here, we're approaching a similar inflection point across a series of energy and materials, technologies and solutions that also are getting to the point where they're just better. And that will create opportunities to build massively in large jurisdictions, but also to build very rapidly scaling solutions in smaller jurisdictions. And how you then go about both investing the capital, delivering solutions, and giving back value to your investors will be a matter for innovators. And maybe the one thing I want to say there is we will need to find that right balance, making sure we're delivering the right things for the communities, but also saying this is a good investment case. It will reward innovation and entrepreneurship. It will reward investment. And we shouldn't be shy about that as well. So there's something there that sits at that uncomfortable balance of the market and the social good, but hopefully also about saying this is not something that we do to or for communities. It is done by them, for themselves, and with investment and with support from those who want to participate in that building of prosperity. I want to really thank Aldo, Kay, Huda, John for giving us this tour across the space, and all of you here for your engagement and your questions. And hopefully you're walking away from this feeling like we are creating green prosperity, hopefully at scale, in this moment of transition. Thank you.